Make it quick, the governor requested, and they did. He got what he wanted from the legislature. What will Arkansas get in return? What he wanted and got from previous sessions is showing up in ways he'd prefer to avoid. So too, inevitably, will an issue he would prefer to disappear. Arkansas Week, next.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. I have a lot on my mind, a lot on my plate, said Governor Hutchinson. So would you, ladies and gentlemen, please do a very quick, speedy job of handling this special legislative session. They complied. Andrew DeMillo joins us. He is the State Capitol Bureau Chief of the Associated Press. Bobby Ampazan here from Arkansas Public Media. Ernie Dumas, an independent journalist and columnist for Arkansas Times. Andrew, they didn't waste any time.
No, it was
a fairly brief agenda, but a substantive one too.
No, it was short and sweet. The absolute minimum special session can last 3 days, and the governor, for the most part, got every single thing that he had on the agenda. He got through, especially his changes to the state's hybrid Medicaid expansion. And now this starts the ball rolling on the state pursuing these new restrictions to the expansion.
He'll need some waivers, but they're anticipated.
Yeah, the two big changes that he's seeking are lowering the eligibility cap for the hybrid expansion from 138% of the poverty level to 100%. That's a move that would end up moving about 60,000 people off the expansion and onto the insurance exchange. He also wants to impose work requirements on some of the remaining participants in the program. The timeline at this point is the state is planning on filing the waiver, which is the formal request for these changes in June, with the hopes of being able to start implementing this next year.
Inter-federal-state relations. We had a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives Thursday, Ernie.
Well, it's hard to separate the two because what happened in Washington yesterday, I guess it was Thursday, may partially obliterate what the governor's special session products. We don't know yet. Nobody knows. The governor doesn't know. Donald Trump doesn't know. Congress doesn't know. Nobody really knows what's going to happen as a result of that. But Congress, which is Republicans in Congress, have been saying since 2010, we're going to repeal Obamacare, which is, as you know, the name for the Affordable Care Act. And so they've been voted many, many times in the House or the Senate to repeal Obamacare. And now that they've got control of all both the House and the Senate and the presidency, they obviously had to repeal Obamacare. But it would prove far more difficult and dangerous, politically dangerous, than I think they calculated. But they did, on the third attempt yesterday, pass a bill in the House that nominally, anyway, repeals the Affordable Care Act, repeals and replaces it over time. It's important to point out that it won't really happen until after the 2018 election, although in the interim, Obamacare may begin to kind of fall apart because of these actions. But it will affect what the governor did in Arkansas in the special session. It may virtually obliterate the Medicaid expansion. We don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but plus it could imperil 700 or 400 or 500 other Arkansans who are dependent upon Medicaid for disabilities, the old age and nursing homes and so forth. How it's going to affect all of those people, we really won't know for some years.
And one of the reasons we don't know is because it now goes to the other end of the U.S. Capitol, where there are some profound reservations about it among Republicans.
Yes, especially Republicans in states that have expanded Medicaid. That's where you're seeing reservations about what this is going to mean for people who have coverage right now. And so it's still, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about what happens with this Republican health care bill. And the question about the uncertainty kept coming up whenever the governor talked about making these changes. Why pursue these when everything still seems in limbo about what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act and whether what's going to happen with Medicaid expansion and the insurance exchanges. The defense that you heard from the governor and from legislative leaders is they can't not act because of uncertainty. They said they've basically said that they can come back and respond if they need to, depending on what Congress does. But they need to take some action now, even with this uncertainty right now.
Well, assuming that there are some structural changes made to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and it becomes more Trump care, the state does still stand to lose some revenue out of this thing. There's no question about it, and particularly it would appear those that are moved from the expansion and back into the marketplace, there's some profound questions that they have to face.
Yeah, the question would be, what happens if the marketplace is done away with? It's an uncertain future for those folks being moved off the expansion. The other concern that's been raised by opponents and by health advocates is concern of there being a drop off. There may not be a guarantee that those 60,000 actually end up purchasing insurance through the exchange. And there's a fear that a lot of the advancements that the advocates say that Arkansas has seen in terms of the uninsured rate going down, uncompensated care costs going down, you could see a reversal of that if you have this drop-off happening.
Yeah, there was a representative from the Arkansas Hospitals Association this week who came out basically in opposition of the Republican tweaks to the Arkansas Works, because it's going to, by a factor of millions and millions of dollars, likely raise the uncompensated healthcare costs that hospitals bear when people come in and need treatment and they're not insured. Hospitals will not turn them away. And so, this is money that kind of, yeah, this is money that just kind of seeps back into this is debt that seeps back into the system. It's interesting. I think Democrats and folks on the left who crowed about the 60,000 people that would be moved off of Medicare and into the insurance marketplace, to that, Governor Hutchinson said, well, there are federal subsidies for tax credits that will ameliorate the sudden potential costs for these folks. But as we saw at the federal level this week, the federal Health Care Act would seek to restrict those funds. So it's almost as if Governor Hutchinson is offering a reasonable kind of excuse for this move that was better suited for last year, before these tweaks at the federal level were made to constrict federal subsidies.
Well, the governor's assumption, or his stated assumption, is that those 60,000 people between who are now on Medicaid, whose earnings yearly are over 100% of the federal poverty line, up to 138% of the poverty line, will get all these federal subsidies that are available to people above 138%. But it's hard to imagine that many of those people can afford even $10 a month. They're already stretched. So it's hard to imagine that many of those people will be able to buy insurance on the market. So my guess is that most of those 60,000 people will be uninsured at the end of next year, when this, which kicks in. We'll have to wait and see. But that was the determination when they drew up the Affordable Care Act, was that up to 138% people simply cannot afford to pay any premiums or co-pays or deductibles or anything else, because they just don't have enough money to support themselves and pay groceries and everything else, and to buy health insurance. So that was, and so the Affordable Care Act says you can't do it. This what the governor is proposing is not allowed by the Affordable Care Act, but there's some provisions in the Affordable Care Act for waivers, and I'm certain that the Trump administration will allow this as a waiver. I think that's a foregone conclusion because it achieves the goal of reducing the number of insured people.
All four of our delegates on the House side in D.C. Eventually voted for. There was some hesitation on the part of the gentleman who sits for the 2nd District, Mr. Hill, but eventually he went with the bill as well. Now we're on the other side of the Capitol, and for months, actually, since the administration took office, there have been some let's pause and consider on the part of both Mr. Bozeman and Mr. Cotton.
Well, without a doubt, the health care bill that was passed this week federally in the House of Representatives is going to be greatly modified by the U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives is a strange kind of soup of Freedom Caucus folks, Democrats, northern, more moderate Republicans, and this barely passed 217 to 213. It now gets kicked over to the Senate, where the power of moderate Republicans is greater. And so you're going to have folks like Lisa Murkowski, maybe Susan Collins of Maine, going to exercise a lot of power over this, and this is going to shift a lot. So the legislation that we see this week likely won't be remotely the same as we move forward throughout the year.
In the meantime, back on state fiscal matters, we had Andrew this week. Well, I think since our last broadcast, we had a week ago, we had the administration confirm, Governor Hutchinson confirmed, we need to cut back, and we've got basically now about 2 months to do it.
Yeah, the governor last week announced that he was cutting the budget for the current fiscal year by about $70 million because revenues had not been coming in as expected. The cuts at this point are going to be in the Category B of the state's budget, which sets priorities based on expected revenue. So these are programs that were not going to be funded until toward the end of the fiscal year anyways. Days later, the finance officials also announced that there would also be a budget cut for the coming fiscal year that begins July 1st of about $43 million. Again, this would also be in Category B of the budget, so it would be lower priority items. But it did coming at the beginning of the special session did raise some concerns among some lawmakers about the kind of financial position of the state right now.
Well, in fact, the administration asked for several $1 million, and the legislature complied to move it out of the the Tobacco Trust Fund and make that available.
Yeah, it was about.
And that had previously been sort of sacrosanct.
Yeah,
dedicated revenue.
Yeah, this had been money in a trust fund under tobacco settlement. About $105 million. Unused money that the governor wanted to move to a long-term reserve fund. The argument being that this apparently was something that the governor and legislative leaders said was needed to improve Arkansas's bond rating, to be able to prove that Arkansas has money that it could tap into in case of a serious budget shortfall. This got through, but there was still some wrangling over it, some questions about the timing of this, the idea of using tobacco settlement money, given the fact that this was from an initiated act back in 2000 that voters had directed this money toward health programs. And also questions about how much of a say the full legislature should have in being able to decide whether or not these funds should be tapped. It still got through, but required a little bit more of a push than I think was anticipated at the beginning.
Well, the tobacco fund isn't really. You couldn't, I suppose, call it seed corn, but Ernie, it's sort of a philosophical cousin to that, is it not? Are we eating seed corn here?
Well,
or close to it.
Yeah, in a way, that's what both the reserve fund and the tobacco fund were kind of reserve funds for hard times. But I've lost my train of thought here. But the whole thing about mid-year budget cuts. This is very unusual in growth times. We've always had that since the passage of the Revenue Stabilization Act in 1947. Had mid-year budget cuts, but usually it's in times of recessions. So the last time we had a mid-year budget cut was in, I think, 2010, when we're just coming out of that very, very deep recession. And in the years before that, there'd been a succession of mid-year budget cuts. But here we are in a period of sustained economic growth, almost 8 years of steady economic growth. The unemployment rate is at a historic low. We have in what used to be described as full employment. We are now at full employment, and usually revenues are flowing in, but instead revenues are flat, and we're cutting the budget, and they're projecting, I suspect, that there will be more budget cuts next year, following the one that was announced by the governor yesterday. So I think there'll be more later.
I think another interesting kind of philosophical split that this decision represents is that the master tobacco settlement funds were directed by a popularly approved plan. This slightly over $100 million was in the Healthy Century Arkansas Fund. It was meant to be directed to health improvement type projects and initiatives. And now it's being shifted over into the long-term reserve fund. And that is not controlled by the same body of people, policymakers. So, it is a philosophical difference between kind of the popularly approved plan back about 17 years ago, and this one, which would be directed by legislators.
We're seeing revenues, Ernie mentioned that they're kind of flat. In fact, sales taxes year to date were, if I'm reading it correctly without my glasses, about 3% under forecast. So this robust economy that obviously is in place, and even Friday morning, the U.S. jobs report was in excess of about 215,000 new jobs, upward trend, very well established by now.
Well, it goes back. The governor doesn't like to admit it, or the legislators either, but we started about under Mike Beebe, actually, in 2007, began to cut taxes. And so every legislative session since 2007, they've cut state taxes, whether it's the sales tax, beginning with the gradually piecemeal ending the sales tax on groceries. Then a succession of tax cuts in the income tax, manufacturers, a whole variety of new tax exemptions for industry. Then now with a succession of income tax cuts in 2013, 2015, and now. But the projection always was that the tax cuts would lead to economic growth, new industries, more jobs, and that the state treasury would benefit from that, so we'd have a flush treasury in spite of these tax cuts. It never happened, and it's clear now that that did not occur. That did not produce at least the kind of revenue growth or the kind of economic growth that would produce gains for the state treasury. So now we're reaping this is the windfall of that.
Well, look at the notes that I'd made from the official DFNA report. Year-to-date net available revenue is $54 million under projections. So couple that with some reductions in personal individual income tax and some corporate income taxes, which are kind of subject to accounting maneuvers. The Category B cuts are understandable, coming even as they do before, with only a couple of months left in the year. Anyway, one other piece of business that came out of the General Assembly, particularly on the House side, Andrew, has to do with not a resolution, but a change in the rules, a very unusual change in rules, unprecedented, I guess, really, because there simply was nothing to. They were starting in square one on this thing.
The House approved basically procedures for the impeachment process. How articles of impeachment can be filed, the votes on it, just kind of spelling out how impeachment can be carried out. This isn't done in a vacuum. This comes amid calls from some Republican lawmakers for the removal of Judge Wendell Griffin. He's faced questions over his participation in what appeared to be an anti-death penalty demonstration the same day that he had issued an order blocking Arkansas from using one of its execution drugs. He's already faced some action from the state Supreme Court, which has disqualified him from taking up any death penalty cases or any cases involving Arkansas's execution protocol. The Judicial Discipline Commission is investigating him now, as well as a complaint he filed against the Supreme Court over their action against him. So this kind of appears to be at least a implicit signal from the legislature that they're looking at taking action against Griffin if the commission doesn't. He's been very critical of the legislature for doing this, pointing out that they haven't impeached other judges who have had criminal or ethical issues, but they're signaling this against him over what up until this point had been more of an issue of how much free speech rights, First Amendment rights does someone on the bench have? Now it's kind of transforming into a fight between the legislative and judicial branches.
Well, Judge Griffin's gone to great lengths and has the law on his side in terms of his First Amendment free speech rights, Ernie.
Well, he does. No less a person than Antonin Scalia, the celebrated conservative justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, wrote an opinion back sometime in their early 1990s, I think, that said that judges have the same speech rights as anybody else, and that you cannot discipline a judge for exercising his free speech rights. Now, there's some other, there's the side issue then of a conflict of interest, whether having participated in that demonstration, he should recuse from anything having to do with the death penalty. That's another issue. But this changes in the procedures on impeachment. There's a legal question about that because it was not done during the legislative session, but kind of an ad hoc thing after the legislative session. They kind of assembled in caucus and did it. Is that legal? Is that binding? So I think there could be a lawsuit. I think John Walker is threatening a lawsuit about that. So there are a lot of legal questions involved in this thing.
Well, which brings us back to the matter of executions, Bobby, and this is something, guys, that Mr. Hutchinson, I'll just be pretty blunt about it, just take this away from me. Let this cup pass from me.
Well, yeah, and I think that it will. So of course, has been talked about a lot. The drug midazolam, the first drug in the lethal injection protocol, is now expired. It expired on May 1st. The state did produce a witness back a few weeks ago who said, the expiration of a drug solution is kind of like the expiration on a can of soda. It's still going to be fine if you pop the can of soda, a few days after expiration. But nonetheless, the state now is functionally out of drugs for its lethal injection. There's been some talk about introducing a new protocol that would, of course, be subject to court scrutiny. So right now, I think that chapter's over, but it's certainly one of the legacies is that it spawned death penalty discussion and action across the country in really interesting ways. There is a single drug protocol that involves a barbiturate like phenobarbital. And maybe that's the future of lethal injection moving forward. But
provided you can obtain this, the state can obtain it, because it's the pharmaceutical companies who are throwing up the barriers on this thing. If we are, for the moment anyway, if the state is out of drugs, it is also, so to speak, out of inmates. At least those who exhausted, death row inmates who have exhausted all their appeals. So there's no immediate pressure to set any execution dates, but the issue simply won't go away.
No,
the General Assembly is likely to revive it in the next regular session.
Yeah, the issue is not going to go away. Governor Hutchinson had dismissed the calls for an independent investigation following Kenneth Williams' execution and witness accounts that he had convulsed and lurched from the gurney. It's not clear that that's going to completely go away. A federal judge had ordered the state to preserve Williams's blood and tissue samples, ordered an autopsy. So we may still see some legal action, some more questions regarding this. So even with the drug expired, there's still going to be some questions around this and more scrutiny over the process here.
Well, is there any question really that the public pressure on the General Assembly and within the General Assembly to deal with this in a different way, either bring back the electric chair and Mr. Hutchinson has said the firing squad, I don't even want to consider that. That's beyond the pale.
I'm not sure if you'd see much of an appetite for going down that road in terms of changing the protocol to go to firing squad, electric chair. There may be more talk looking at the process in terms of the drug protocol or other parts of the process. But I think a dramatic change like that, I doubt you would see in the near future.
Yeah.
The state of Florida brought back the electric chair as a possibility for the death penalty. Mississippi is considering a range, or has on the books a range of possibilities. This is a really interesting debate here in Arkansas because people. It might not feel this way now, but Arkansas really enjoys a pretty new Republican majority. As recently as a few years ago, there was no Republican majority. The death penalty is not a wedge issue in the classic sense of abortion or some other ones. The death penalty has a lot of religious conservatives who are anti-death penalty. So I think this is an issue that Arkansas Republicans are not real keen to bring to the fore the way they were this last session on certain religious topics and other kind of guns on campus and other kind of traditional conservative topics. I think there's a lot of state Republicans that would like to move away from the death penalty as a front and center topic of discussion here.
Got to end it there. We're out of time, guys. Thanks to you for coming, and as always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.